1917, two revolutions, February and October. 1918, the beginning of the Civil War. The main opposing forces were the Bolsheviks and the White Guards, and 10 forces, Central Powers, and forces of local independence movements, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and others, also took part in the war. Although the Gulag was not officially established until 1934, its creation was preceded by a long history of Soviet camps, beginning in 1917. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks established the first Soviet forced labor camps. Lenin had the idea of camps before the October Revolution even. We must introduce labor conscription for the gentlemen shareholders, bankers and factory workers, whose spirits are sluggish due to the fact that there are no incentives which formally induce them to work. We must force the gentlemen shareholders to submit to the state, and there must be a conscription for them, a labor conscription. In January 1918, Lenin goes even further. He telegraphed Antonov Ovsienko, "I especially approve and welcome the arrest of millionaire saboteurs in the first and second class carriage. I advise that they be sent for 6 months to forced labor in the mines." But what about Lenin's views on the nature of crime and the role of the state apparatus in that crime? From Lenin's The State and Revolution, written between August and September 1917, i.e. before the October Revolution. Under capitalism, we have the state in the proper sense of the word, a special machine for the suppression of one class by another, and, moreover, of the majority by the minority. In the transition from capitalism to communism, suppression is still necessary, but already the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the exploited. A special apparatus, a special machine for suppression, a state, is still necessary, but it is already a transitional state. It is no longer a state in the proper sense, for the suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of yesterday's wage slaves is so comparatively easy, simple and natural that it will cost much less bloodshed than the suppression of the uprising of slaves, serfs, wage laborers, that it will cost mankind much less. And from the same work, finally, only communism creates the complete unnecessity of the state, for there is no one to suppress, no one in the sense of class, in the sense of systematic struggle against a certain part of the population. We know that the root social cause of excesses consisting in the violation of the rules of society is the exploitation of the masses, their needs and poverty. With the elimination of this root cause, the excesses will inevitably begin to die out. With their dying out, the state will die out as well. Along with this, a new enemy appears, the class enemy, who is secretly trying to destroy the gains of the revolutions. The Bolshevik decree on bribery, issued in May 1918, stated that if the offense was committed by a person belonging to the property class who used the bribe in order to preserve or acquire privileges connected with the right of property, he shall be sentenced the most severe and unpleasant forced labor, and all his property shall be confiscated. But no one ever gave clear criteria for what a class enemy should be. The revolutionary tribunals, consisting of hastily selected supporters of the revolution, passed sentences on bankers, merchants' wives, speculators, former wardens of Tsarist prisons, and all suspicious persons. During the Civil War, the Red Army took hostages from among the bourgeoisie, who were then used as labor force, forced to dig trenches and build fortifications. For the first time after the revolution, all prisoners, criminal and political, were placed in ordinary prisons, run by the traditional law enforcement agencies. First the People's Commissariat of Justice, then the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, that is, they were imprisoned in the prisons left over from the Tsarist system, usually dirty, dingy brick buildings in the center of every major city. In 1917 to 1920, complete arbitrariness reigned there. Crowds stormed the prisons, self-appointed commissars dismissed wardens, prisoners were granted broad amnesties or simply escaped. On 5th February 1918, Lenin personally demanded, "Take urgent measures for the immediate improvement of the food supply in the Petrograd prisons." But conditions were still poor. A couple of months later, a member of the Cheka, All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, visited Taganskaya prison and noted the cold, fever, typhus, and hunger. But for some people, the conditions of imprisonment were quite bearable. For example, Robert Bruce Lockhart, a British diplomat accused of espionage, was arrested and imprisoned in the Kremlin in 1918. Yet he avoided facing trial by being exchanged for Maxim Litvinov, the representative of the Bolshevik government in London, who was arrested for participating in propaganda activities. In prisons, nepotism was spreading, escapes were frequent, irresponsible wardens, confusion reigned, and it became clear that especially dangerous criminals of class enemies could not be placed in ordinary prisons. Already on 9th August 1918, in connection with the anti-Bolshevik uprising in Penza, Lenin called for, quote, "merciless mass terror against Gulags, popes, and white guards. Those who were doubtful should be locked up in a concentration camp outside the city," unquote. By 1918, 3 authorities were in charge of places of detention. People's Commissariat of Justice was in charge of ordinary prisons. Cheka was in charge of the special camps. The People's Commissariat for Military Affairs of the RSFSR managed the detention of captives and refugees. The People's Commissariat for Military Affairs of the RSFSR just had at its disposal a wide network of concentration camps where prisoners of war of the First World War were kept. In the beginning of 1918, about 2 million people. After the Brest Peace Treaty was concluded, a wide exchange of prisoners of war began. The camps were placed under the jurisdiction of the Cheka. But what was the Cheka at that time? The full name of the authority was the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission to Combat Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, under the Council of People's Commissars of the RSFSR, where Cheka under the SNK RSFSR. It was declared that the Cheka was to be the leading organ of the struggle against counter-revolution throughout the country. The Cheka was the main instrument for the realization of the Red Terror. Red Terror was the repression carried out by the Bolsheviks during the Civil War against so-called class enemies. Krasnaya Gazeta, the organ of the Red Army, wrote, quote, "By hundreds we will kill enemies. Let it be thousands, let them choke it in all blood. Let them choke in their own blood. For the blood of Lenin and Uritsky, let streams of blood be shed. More blood as much as possible." The Cheka had no tradition of observing the law, no legal obligations, no need to coordinate its actions with the police, the judiciary, or the People's Commissariat of Justice. Concentration camps, or special purpose camps, played an important role in the Red Terror. Concentration camps were mentioned in the Cheka Order on the Red Terror, which decreed to, quote, "to arrest as hostages the major representatives of the bourgeoisie, landlords, factory workers, merchants, counter-revolutionary popes, all officers hostile to the Soviet power, and imprison all the public in the concentration camps." But even a month before this Cheka order, Lev Trotsky, the People's Commissar for Military Affairs, ordered, quote, "The Chief of Defense of the Moscow-Kazan railway line, Comrade Kamenshikov, appointed by me, has ordered the establishment of concentration camps in Murom, Arzamas and Sviarsk, where dark agitators, counter-revolutionary officers, saboteurs, parasites, speculators will be imprisoned, except those who will be shot on the spot or sentenced to other punishments by the Military Revolutionary Tribunal. By the end of 1919, there were 21 camps in Russia. By the end of 1920, there were 107 camps. But the purpose of the camps remained unclear, and various Soviet figures and authorities gave different answers to this question. In February 1919, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was then chairman of Cheka, said, quote, "I propose to keep these concentration camps for the use of the labor of arrested persons, for gentlemen living without occupation, for those who cannot work without some compulsion. Or if we take Soviet institutions, then there should be a measure of such punishment for bad faith, for negligence, for lateness, etc." In the spring of 1918, the Cheka was instructed to organize forced labor camps in each province. The camps could be located both within the city and in estates, monasteries, manors, etc. in the vicinity of the city. An 8-hour working day was introduced. Food transfers to individual prisoners were forbidden. All transferred food had to go into a common pot. Visits with close relatives were allowed, but only on Sundays and public holidays. An escape attempt could be punished by a 10-fold increase in the term, and a second attempt could be punished by firing squad. These camps were not only places of honor and disease, but also of humiliation and arbitrariness. When the White Guards temporarily took over Poltava, their commission submitted a report stating that while the city was under Bolshevik control, bourgeois class prisoners were forced into labor that constituted ridicule and humiliation. For example, one of the arrested was ordered to remove dirt from the floor with his bare hands, while another was given a tablecloth instead of a rag and ordered to clean the lavatory. But it was not only the prisoners of the camps who were subjected to arbitrary behavior. In October 1918, the commander of the Northern Front demanded from the Petrograd authorities 800 laborers urgently needed to lay roads and dig trenches. There was still a shortage of laborers, and the local council ordered a section of Nevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg to be cordoned off. Anyone without a party card or civil servant ID to be arrested and housed in nearby barracks. The men were sent to the Northern Front as laborers. Free laborers, during this period of the Civil War, were at times not much different from prisoners. Trotsky claimed to turn the entire population of the country into a labor army, modeled on the Red Army. Workers in the number of professions were required to register with state institutions which could send them anywhere in the country. Certain categories of workers, miners for example, were forbidden to transfer to other jobs. Although for most of the 1920s the concepts of camp, prison and forced labor were very vague by the end of the Civil War, by the autumn of 1922 a certain system had developed. The ordinary prison system, where mainly criminals were held, was first run by the People's Commissariat of Justice and later by the People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, NKVD. The system of special purpose camps was run, as I said, by the Cheka, which was then transformed into the GPU, then into the OGPU from 1923 to 1934. By the way, it was this organ that would become the infamous KGB in the future. But many camps passed from the management of one authority to another. The authorities themselves changed their powers, were abolished, created. I won't go through the whole history of these changes. These camps were hidden from the public, they had special rules, a stricter regime, harsher penalties for escape. This special system of places of deprivation of liberty dealt with priests, former Tsarist servants, merchants, speculators, enemies of the new system. But among them was a special political group. It included members of small revolutionary and socialist parties, anarchists, left and right ussrs, Mensheviks, and all other who were in favor of the revolution but were not members of Lenin's Bolshevik party and did not participate in October 1917 coup. As former allies in the revolutionary struggle against the Tsarist regime, they deserved special treatment. The Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks debated their fate until the late 1930s, when most of those who were still alive were arrested or shot. Prisoners from this special category of political were much harder to control. Many had spent years in Tsarist prisons and knew how to organize hunger strikes, exert moral pressure on warders, establish cell-to-cell communication and organize joint protests. They often had connections with the outside world, including abroad. Most of the Russian small socialist parties still had emigrant cells, mainly in Berlin or Paris, and their members could do considerable damage to the international image of the Bolsheviks. In 1921, at the Third Congress of the Comintern, the emigrant socialists read a letter from the imprisoned comrades in Russia. The letter caused a sensation at the Congress. It stated that prison conditions in revolutionary Russia were worse than in Tsarist times. Prisoners were starving, many of them were deprived of visits, correspondence, and walks for months. The political Red Cross started back in the 1970s. The political Red Cross was concerned about prisoners. The political Red Cross won the right to visit places of detention, meet with political prisoners, send them parcels, and petition for the release of the sick. The Bolsheviks were so concerned about the bad publicity that Western socialists and the political Red Cross were spreading about them that in 1922 they created a communist equivalent of the political Red Cross, the International Red Aid, Russian acronym MOPR. The International Red Aid was dedicated to supporting communist and anarchist prisoners around the world, such as Antonio Gramsci, Georgy Dimitrov, Sacco and Vanzetti, among others. Propaganda was having its effect. When the French writer Roman Rolland was asked to comment on a published collection of letters from socialist prisoners in Soviet prisons, he stated, "Almost the same thing is happening in Polish prisons and in California prisons where members of the industrial workers of the world are being tortured. The same thing is happening in English prisons in the Andaman Islands." Typical examples of the camps we discussed earlier are the camps in Kholmogory and Petrominsk. They were established by the Soviet government in late 1919. Prisoners were strictly forbidden to correspond with their relatives or to receive parcels of food or clothing from them. All letters were destroyed. Prisoners were shot. These concentration camps were ideal for imprisonment and liquidation of white guard officers and soldiers, Kronstadt sailors, remnants of the Kolchak army, various Siberian and Ukrainian atamans, peasants from Tambov province who joined Antonov's movement, tens of thousands of intellectuals of all nationalities and religions, Kuban and Don Cossacks, all flocked to Kholmogory and Petrominsk. But it became clear that it was becoming more and more difficult to control the prisoners. In 1923, a solution was found, Solovki.